The ink on Hannah Owens' fingertips had become as familiar as the calluses from churning butter, and she wondered if the cowboy 400 miles away in Colorado territory ever noticed the smudged corners of her letters where her hand dragged across the still wet words. It was March of 1883, and Helena, Montana had just emerged from a brutal winter that left the streets thick with mud and the air sharp enough to sting exposed skin. Hannah stood at the window of her father's mercantile, watching the morning stage roll in, knowing it would not bring what she truly wanted. The stage brought supplies, occasionally news from the east, sometimes new settlers looking to strike it rich in the gold fields, but it never brought Austin Nichols. Not yet, anyway. Her father, Bernard Owens, called from the back room where he was inventorying the new shipment of dry goods. "Hannah, those shelves won't stock themselves." She turned from the window, tucking a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. At 22, she was considered by many in Helena to be past her prime marrying age, a fact her mother reminded her of with increasing frequency before she had passed 2 winters ago from pneumonia. Now it was just Hannah and her father, running the mercantile, living in the rooms above it, existing in a quiet routine that felt like waiting for something neither of them could name. Except Hannah could name it. She had been naming it in letters for almost a year now. It had started innocently enough. Her father had placed an advertisement in several Western newspapers for a new supplier of leather goods, someone who could provide quality saddles, reins, and other tack at reasonable prices. Austin Nichols had responded from a ranch outside of Durango, Colorado territory, where he worked as a ranch hand and part-time leather worker. His first letter had been purely business, outlining his prices and the quality of his work, including a small sample of tooled leather that showed genuine craftsmanship. Hannah had written back on her father's behalf, as she handled most of the mercantile's correspondence. Her letter had also been strictly business, placing an initial order and negotiating terms. But at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, she had added a single personal line. "The tooling on your sample was extraordinarily beautiful. You have a real gift." His next letter, which arrived 3 weeks later along with the first shipment of goods, had included a response to that line. "Thank you for noticing the detail. Most folks only care if the leather holds. It is nice to know someone appreciates the artistry." From there, somehow, the letters had grown. Hannah began adding longer postscripts to the business correspondence. Austin did the same. Then the personal sections became longer than the business portions. Then they began writing separate letters entirely, personal ones that had nothing to do with leather goods or mercantile orders. Hannah learned that Austin was 25 years old, that he had come west from Kentucky after his parents died of fever when he was 17, that he had worked on ranches from Texas to Colorado, learning the cowboy trade and picking up leatherwork from an old Mexican craftsman who had taken him under his wing. He wrote about the mountains he could see from the ranch, about the hard work of cattle drives, about his dreams of one day having his own small spread where he could raise horses and continue his leatherwork. She wrote to him about life in Helena, about the roughness of the mining town mixed with attempts at civilization, about running the mercantile with her father, about her mother's death and the hollow space it left, about her love of reading the few books that made their way to Montana, about watching the seasons change on Mount Helena. As the months passed, the letters became more frequent. Once a month became twice a month became weekly. Hannah found herself rushing to the post office every few days, her heart lifting when the postmaster handed her an envelope in Austin's now familiar handwriting. She memorized the way he formed his letters, slightly cramped, practical, but with occasional flourishes that suggested an artistic soul beneath the cowboy exterior. By autumn, the tone of the letters had shifted into something neither of them could deny. Austin wrote things like, "I find myself thinking about what you wrote regarding the sunset over the mountains here, and I wish you could see it in person. I wish I could watch you see it." Hannah responded with equal vulnerability. "Sometimes when I am alone in the mercantile after closing, I imagine what it would be like to have someone to share the silence with, someone who understands both the loneliness and the peace of it." In December, as snow buried both Helena and Durango, Austin wrote something that made Hannah's hands shake as she read it in the privacy of her small bedroom. "Hannah, I know this might seem forward given that we have never met in person, but I need you to know that I wait for your letters the way a man dying of thirst waits for rain. Your words are the brightest part of my days. I think about you constantly. I dream about the color of your eyes, even though you have never described them to me. I imagine the sound of your voice. I know this is unconventional, but then again, nothing about our acquaintance has been conventional. I think I am falling in love with the woman whose soul I have come to know through ink and paper." Hannah had read that letter 20 times before she finally wrote back, her own hand trembling. "Your letter arrived today, and I have been sitting here trying to find the courage to tell you that I feel the same way. I know people would say we are foolish, that you cannot love someone you have never met, but I feel that I know you better than I have known anyone. You have seen parts of me I have never shown another living soul. My eyes are green, by the way, green with small flecks of gold near the center, or so my mother used to tell me. Through the brutal Montana winter, their letters became love letters in truth. They wrote about futures and possibilities. Austin admitted that he had saved most of his wages for the past 5 years, that he had nearly enough to buy a small piece of land. Hannah confessed that she had a small inheritance from her mother, not much, but enough to help start a life somewhere new. In February, as Hannah turned 22 and winter still held Montana in its grip, Austin's letter contained a question that changed everything. "Hannah, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot keep loving you from 400 miles away. I want to meet you. I want to hear your voice. I want to see those green and gold eyes in person. I want to hold your hand. I know this is bold, and I know I am just a cowboy with rough hands and limited prospects, but I love you. I love you in a way that makes everything else in my life feel like I was just waiting to find you. If you will have me, I want to marry you. I will come to Helena. I will ride every one of those 400 miles to stand in front of you and ask you properly. Just tell me that I have not misunderstood what we have been writing about all these months. Tell me you feel what I feel." Hannah had cried when she read that letter, tears dropping onto the paper and blurring some of Austin's words. She wrote back immediately, her heart in her throat. "Yes, come to Helena. Come as soon as you can. I love you too, Austin Nichols. I love you so much that I ache with it. I know we have never met. I know people will think we are crazy, but I do not care. Come to me. I will marry you. I will marry you the day you arrive if you want. Just come." She posted the letter the next morning, the 1st of March. Now it was mid-March and she was waiting. Austin's letter had said he would need to give notice at the ranch, to settle his affairs, to prepare for the journey. He thought he could leave by early March, which meant he should arrive by the end of the month if the weather cooperated and the journey went smoothly. 400 miles on horseback through territory that could still see late winter storms. 400 miles through land that held dangers from weather, wildlife, and sometimes worse. Hannah tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. Instead, she went through her days in a state of contained anticipation, helping her father in the mercantile, managing the accounts, serving customers, all while her mind wandered to a cowboy she had never met who was riding north to make her his wife. Her father had noticed the change in her, of course. One evening in early March, after they had closed the mercantile and were having dinner in the rooms above, he set down his fork and looked at her directly. "You have been different these past months. Happier, distracted. Does this have something to do with all those letters from our Colorado supplier?" Hannah felt her cheeks flush, but she met her father's gaze steadily. She was not a child, and she would not hide this. "His name is Austin Nichols. We have been corresponding. It started with business, but it became more, much more." Her father was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. At 54, he had lived through the rush to California, the establishment of Montana Territory, the rough early days of Helena. He was not a man easily shocked. "How much more?" he finally asked. "He is coming to Helena. He wants to marry me." I told him yes. If she expected shock or anger, she was surprised. Her father simply nodded slowly, something almost like relief crossing his face. "I wondered when something like this might happen. You have been too isolated here, Hannah. After your mother died, I worried about you. This town is full of miners and drifters, not many good prospects for a woman of your intelligence and character. But are you certain about this? Marrying a man you have never met?" "I am more certain of this than I have been of anything in my life," Hannah said quietly. "I know it seems rash. I know people will talk. But Papa, I know him. Through his letters, I know his heart, his mind, his soul. I trust him completely." Her father reached across the table and patted her hand, his own hand rough and scarred from years of hard work. "Your mother and I knew each other for 3 days before we married. We were crossing to California on the same wagon train. Her family's wagon broke down. My father helped fix it, and by the time we reached our first stop, I had asked her father for permission to court her. 3 days later, we were married by a circuit preacher. We had 23 good years together before the fever took her. Sometimes you just know, Hannah. Sometimes the heart understands things the mind cannot explain." Tears welled in Hannah's eyes. "He should be here soon, any day now if his timing was right and the weather held. Then I will look forward to meeting the man who won my daughter's heart through words alone," her father said. "That takes a special kind of person." Now, standing at the mercantile window on this March morning, Hannah thought about that conversation. Her father had been supportive, even happy for her, which was more than she had dared hope. But Austin still had not arrived, and with each passing day, worry crept further into her thoughts. The morning wore on. Hannah stocked shelves, helped customers, processed accounts, all while part of her mind remained trained on the street outside, watching for a stranger on horseback, who she would somehow have to recognize by nothing more than instinct and hope. Around midday, as Helena's main street bustled with activity, a single rider came into town from the south. Hannah noticed him immediately, not because he looked particularly distinctive, but because something in the way he sat his horse, the way he looked around at the town with careful, assessing eyes, made her breath catch. The rider was tall. She could see that even mounted. He wore typical cowboy gear, a worn leather jacket, chaps darkened with trail dust, a hat pulled low against the spring sun that had emerged from the morning clouds. His horse was a sturdy bay gelding that looked trail-weary but well cared for. The man moved with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. Hannah's heart began to pound so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She watched as the rider dismounted in front of the mercantile, tied his horse to the hitching post, and stood for a moment, seeming to gather himself. Even from inside, she could see that he was nervous, the way his hand ran down his jacket as if smoothing it, the way he adjusted his hat twice before finally stepping toward the door. The bell above the door chimed. The man walked in, and Hannah's world narrowed to just him. He was younger than some of the cowboys who passed through Helena, probably mid-20s, with dark hair visible beneath his hat, and a strong, angular face made even more handsome by clear blue eyes that swept the mercantile before landing on her. Those eyes widened slightly, and Hannah knew. She just knew. Hannah. His voice was rough from trail dust but warm, with a slight Kentucky accent still clinging to his words despite years out west. Hannah Owens. She could not speak. She could only nod, her hands gripping the edge of the counter to keep herself steady. This was Austin. This was the man who had written her dozens of letters, who had shared his dreams and fears, who had told her he loved her before they had ever seen each other's faces. He crossed the mercantile floor in quick strides, and suddenly he was standing right in front of her, close enough that she could see the trail dust on his jacket, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his blue eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. "I rode 400 miles," he said softly, "to stand here and look at you, to hear your voice, to ask you in person what I asked you in my letter." Hannah found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "You made it. You are here. You are real." Something in Austin's expression softened, vulnerability showing through. "I was half afraid I would get here and find out that you had changed your mind, that meeting in person would somehow break the spell of what we built through letters." "No," Hannah said, more firmly now. She reached out, hesitating only a moment before placing her hand on his arm. Even through his jacket, she could feel the solidity of him, the warmth, the absolute reality of him standing here after months of knowing him only as words on paper. "No, it does not break anything. It makes it more real." Austin covered her hand with his own, and the touch sent a shock through Hannah's entire body. His hands were as rough as he had always described in his letters, calloused from hard work, but his touch was gentle, reverent almost. "I need to do this properly," Austin said. Then, to Hannah's shock and delight, he lowered himself to one knee right there in the middle of the mercantile, still holding her hand. "Hannah Owens, I fell in love with your words before I ever saw your face. I fell in love with your mind, your heart, your strength. Now that I am here, looking at you, I am falling in love all over again with the woman who is even more beautiful than I imagined. I am just a cowboy with rough hands and simple dreams, but I promise that if you marry me, I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a stranger from 400 miles away. Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Hannah's face now, and she did not care who saw, did not care about the few customers in the mercantile who had stopped to stare. "Yes," she said. "I already told you yes in my letter, but I will say it again in person. Yes, Austin Nichols, I will marry you." Austin stood, and for a moment they just looked at each other, both seeming overwhelmed by the reality of finally being in the same space. Then Hannah stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and Austin wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. She pressed her face against his chest, feeling his heartbeat through his jacket, breathing in the smell of leather and horse and trail dust and him. "You are real," she whispered against his chest. "You are actually here." She felt his hand come up to stroke her hair, infinitely gentle. "I am here. I rode through a late snowstorm in southern Colorado, forded a river that was running higher than I liked, camped in the cold and pushed harder than I have ever pushed, all to get here as fast as I could. I could not stand another day without seeing you." Hannah pulled back enough to look up at him, and what she saw in his face took her breath away. Love. Unmistakable, overwhelming love. It was the same emotion she had felt building through months of letters, but seeing it reflected in his eyes and his expression made it 1,000 times more powerful. "How soon?" she asked. "How soon can we marry?" A slow smile spread across Austin's face, transforming it from handsome to absolutely breathtaking. "I was hoping you would ask that. How about now, today? I did not ride 400 miles to wait. If you are sure, if you truly want this, then I want to marry you today." "There is a preacher in town," Hannah said, her mind already racing ahead. "Reverend Matthews. He has a church 2 streets over, and we would need witnesses. My father, he knows about you, he is supportive. And maybe the postmaster, Mr. Keegan. He has been handing me your letters for months with this knowing look in his eyes." "Then let us go get married," Austin said simply. "Right now. I have a ring." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "It was my mother's. It is the only thing I have left from her. I know it might not fit, we can get it sized, but I wanted to have something to give you today." Hannah took the ring with shaking hands. It was a simple band, slightly worn but beautiful in its simplicity. She slipped it onto her finger, and miraculously it fit almost perfectly, just a touch loose. "It is perfect," she said. "Everything about this is perfect." The mercantile door to the back rooms opened, and Hannah's father emerged, probably coming to see what was taking Hannah so long with the customers. He stopped when he saw Hannah and Austin standing together, her hand in his, both of their faces tear-streaked and glowing. "Papa," Hannah said, "this is Austin Nichols." Understanding dawned immediately on Bernard Owens' face. He crossed the mercantile floor and extended his hand to Austin, who shook it firmly. "Mr. Owens," Austin said, "I know I should have written to ask your permission properly, but I fell in love with your daughter through her letters, and I could not wait any longer to come here and make her my wife. I hope I have your blessing." Bernard looked between them, taking in their joined hands, the obvious emotion on both their faces, the way they kept glancing at each other as if to confirm the other was real. "You rode 400 miles to marry a woman you had never met," he said. "That is either the bravest or most foolish thing I have ever heard of." He paused, then smiled. "I think it is brave. You have my blessing. Take care of her, son. She is all I have left." "I will," Austin said solemnly. "I swear it." "Good," Bernard said. "Now I assume you are not planning to wait." "We want to marry today," Hannah said. "Right now, if possible." Her father nodded as if he had expected nothing less. "Then I will close the mercantile early. Let me change into my good suit. Austin, you might want to brush some of that trail dust off." "Hannah, your mother's good dress is in your wardrobe, the blue one she made you 2 years ago. Go put it on." They scattered to prepare, moving with the urgency of people who had waited long enough. Hannah rushed upstairs to her small bedroom and pulled out the dress her father had mentioned. It was a deep blue cotton with small white flowers embroidered along the collar and cuffs, the finest dress she owned. Her mother had made it for her 21st birthday, one of the last things she had completed before the pneumonia took her. Hannah changed quickly, her hands shaking with excitement and nerves. She brushed out her hair and repinned it, trying to make herself look less like a shopkeeper and more like a bride. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, she saw a woman transformed by happiness, her green eyes bright, her cheeks flushed, her whole face glowing. Downstairs, Austin had indeed brushed off the worst of the trail dust and had removed his jacket to reveal a clean shirt underneath. He had also shaved quickly using the basin in the mercantile's back room that Bernard had offered him. When Hannah came down the stairs and he saw her in the blue dress, his entire face lit up. "You are so beautiful," he said softly. "Even more beautiful than I imagined, and I have done nothing but imagine you for months." Bernard emerged in his one good suit, looking more formal than Hannah had seen him since her mother's funeral. "Ready?" he asked. They walked together through Helena's muddy streets to Reverend Matthew's church, a small wooden structure that served the town's more respectable citizens. Several people stared as they passed, clearly curious about the stranger in town, and why Bernard Owens was walking through the streets in his good suit in the middle of the day with his daughter dressed in her finest. The Reverend was in the church, preparing for the Sunday service still days away. He looked surprised when they entered, but recovered quickly when Bernard explained the situation. Reverend Matthews was a practical man who had performed many unusual marriages in his time in Montana, and a couple wanting to marry after a long correspondence hardly registered as the strangest. "I will need witnesses," the Reverend said. "I will stand as witness," Bernard said immediately. "And we were hoping to ask Mr. Keegan from the post office." "I will send my wife to fetch him," Reverend Matthews said. "Within 20 minutes, Mrs." Matthews had returned with a curious but willing Mr. Keegan, a portly man in his 50s who had indeed been handing Hannah letters from Colorado with increasing frequency and a knowing twinkle in his eye. "So the Colorado cowboy finally came for you," Mr. Keegan said with a smile. "I had a feeling this is where all those letters were leading." They gathered in front of the simple wooden altar. The church was modest, no stained glass or ornate decorations, just wooden pews and a cross on the wall, but to Hannah it felt more sacred than any cathedral could have. This was where she and Austin would make their vows, where they would bind their lives together after a year of knowing each other only through words. Reverend Matthews began the ceremony, his voice steady and solemn. Hannah barely heard the traditional words, too focused on Austin standing beside her, his hand holding hers, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. She was aware of saying "I do" when prompted, of Austin's voice, stronger and clearer than hers, declaring the same. She was aware of him slipping the gold band onto her finger, of the Reverend pronouncing them husband and wife, of Austin's hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness as he leaned down to kiss her for the first time. The kiss was soft, almost tentative, both of them aware of their audience and the sacredness of the moment. But even in its brevity, Hannah felt the promise of passion held in check, of desire tempered by respect, of love that would have a lifetime to express itself. When they pulled apart, Hannah saw that Austin's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "My wife," he said softly, as if testing the words. "Hannah Nichols." "My husband," she replied, joy flooding through her. "Austin Nichols, who rode 400 miles to marry me." They signed the marriage certificate. Mr. Keegan and Bernard signed as witnesses, and just like that, they were married. The entire ceremony had taken perhaps 30 minutes. Hannah and Austin had known each other in person for less than 2 hours. And yet, as they walked out of the church into the spring afternoon, Hannah felt more certain of this choice than she had ever felt about anything. Her father invited them to dinner, giving the newlyweds a knowing look that suggested he understood they might want time alone, but also knew that practical matters needed addressing. Over a meal of roast beef and potatoes that Bernard had prepared in their small apartment above the mercantile, they talked about the future. "I have been thinking about this for months," Austin said, his hand finding Hannah's under the table and holding it throughout the meal. "I have some money saved. Not a lot, but enough to buy a small piece of land if we are careful. I was thinking somewhere between here and Durango, maybe in Wyoming, good horse country. I could continue the leather work and maybe start raising horses like I have always wanted." "What about the mercantile?" Bernard asked, looking at Hannah. "I cannot run it alone." Hannah bit her lip, torn between her new husband and her responsibility to her father, But Bernard held up a hand before she could speak. "I am not trying to keep you here, daughter. I am trying to figure out logistics. I am 54 years old in good health and perfectly capable of hiring help, or maybe even selling the mercantile and doing something different myself. Lord knows I have been running this store for 20 years. Maybe it is time for a change for all of us." "You would sell?" Hannah asked, surprised. Her father smiled. "Your mother and I always talked about maybe trying our hand at ranching, getting out of town, having some land. Never did it because we had the mercantile and then you were settled here. But maybe now is the time." "What if," he said, warming to the idea, "what if I sold the mercantile and bought land near wherever you two settle? Not right on top of you," he added quickly, "but close enough that we are still family, still see each other regular. I could run some cattle, have a garden, live out my days without having to smile at every grubby miner who comes in wanting credit he will never pay back." Hannah looked at Austin, who was nodding slowly. "I would like that, sir. I would like Hannah to have family nearby. And truth be told, I could use the help getting started. If you were nearby, we could help each other. You could run cattle, I could raise horses. We could share the load." "Wyoming, then," Bernard said decisively. "I have heard good things about the territory. Growing but not overrun. Good land still available at reasonable prices. What do you say we all go down there together, scout for land, and see about building a new life?" Hannah felt tears prick her eyes again. "You would really do that, Papa? Leave Helena? Sweetheart, the only thing keeping me in Helena was you. With you starting a new life, there is nothing holding me here. Besides, your mother would have loved this idea. She always wanted to see more of the West." He raised his glass of water in a toast. "To new beginnings. To following your heart, even if it means riding 400 miles or selling everything you know to start over." They clinked glasses, and Hannah felt the last piece of worry fall away. She would not have to choose between her father and her husband. They would all go forward together, building something new. After dinner, Bernard tactfully announced that he had some evening inventory to complete in the mercantile, and that Austin and Hannah should use the upstairs apartment for the night. "I will bunk in the back room of the store," he said. "Done it plenty of times before. You two are newlyweds. You deserve some privacy." So Hannah found herself alone with her husband for the first time, climbing the stairs to the apartment that had been her home since they had moved to Helena 10 years ago. Suddenly shy, she busied herself lighting lamps while Austin stood somewhat awkwardly in the middle of the small sitting room, looking around at the modest space. "This is where you wrote the letters," he said softly. "This is where you sat and told me about your life, about your thoughts and dreams." "At that desk," Hannah said, pointing to a small writing desk in the corner near the window. "I would sit there after the mercantile closed and I would write to you. Sometimes deep into the night, telling you things I had never told anyone." Austin crossed to the desk and ran his hand over it gently, as if touching something sacred. "I did the same. In the bunkhouse at the ranch, while the other hands were playing cards or sleeping, I would write to you by lamplight. They teased me about it, but I did not care. Those letters were the best part of my days." Hannah moved to stand beside him, and he turned to face her, his expression soft and wondering. "I cannot quite believe we are really here," he said. "That you are real, that we are married, that I get to stay instead of just passing through. We have a whole life ahead of us now," Hannah said. "All those things we wrote about, all those dreams, we can actually make them happen." "I want to kiss you again," Austin said quietly. "Is that all right? I know we are married now, so I suppose I do not need to ask, but I want you to know that I will always ask. I will always make sure you want what I want." In answer, Hannah reached up and pulled his face down to hers, kissing him with more confidence than she had in the church. This kiss was longer, deeper, both of them exploring this new physical dimension of a relationship that had been built entirely on emotional and intellectual connection until today. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Austin rested his forehead against hers. "I should tell you," he said, his voice rough, "that I am not entirely experienced in this area. I have spent most of my adult life working ranches, moving from place to place. There have not been many women and none that mattered. I want to be honest with you about that." Hannah felt a rush of affection for his vulnerability. "I appreciate your honesty. I have no experience at all, but we will figure it out together. That is what marriage is it not? Figuring things out together." They moved to the bedroom, both nervous but eager, and in the privacy of the night they discovered each other in ways that letters could never convey. Austin was gentle and patient, his rough cowboy hands surprisingly tender, and Hannah found a passion in herself she had not known existed. They loved each other with the intensity of two people who had waited and longed and dreamed, and when they finally lay spent and tangled together in the narrow bed, Hannah felt complete in a way she never had before. "I love you," Austin whispered into her hair. "I loved you before I met you, but now, knowing all of you, I love you even more. I did not think that was possible." "I love you too," Hannah replied, tracing patterns on his bare chest. "Thank you for riding 400 miles. Thank you for being brave enough to come for me." "I would have ridden 4,000, he said. "There is nowhere I would not go to be with you." They talked deep into the night, making plans, sharing more stories, learning the sound of each other's voices in the darkness. Hannah learned that Austin's laugh was warm and genuine, that he had a scar on his shoulder from a bad fall from a horse when he was 19, that he preferred coffee strong enough to strip paint. Austin learned that Hannah hummed while she worked, that she was terrified of spiders despite living in Montana, that she had a secret love of penny dreadfuls that she never admitted to anyone because she thought they made her seem frivolous. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the sky outside the window, they fell asleep wrapped around each other, exhausted and perfectly content. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity and happiness. Bernard made arrangements to sell the mercantile to a young couple who had recently arrived in Helena looking to establish themselves in business. It took some negotiating, but by early April, they had a deal that was fair to both parties. Meanwhile, Austin and Hannah spent every moment together, making up for the year they had been apart. Austin helped in the mercantile while they waited for the sale to finalize, and Hannah marveled at how easily he fit into her life, how right it felt to work side by side with him. Customers quickly warmed to the tall cowboy with the ready smile and the genuine interest in people. In the evenings, they would sit together in the apartment, and Austin would tell her stories of his years as a cowboy, while she would read to him from her small collection of books. Sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence, Austin working on leather pieces while Hannah sewed or kept accounts, both simply content to be in each other's presence. At night, they continued to explore their physical relationship, growing more comfortable and confident with each other, their lovemaking becoming a conversation of its own, another way they learned to communicate and connect. By late April, the sale of the mercantile was complete, and they began making concrete plans to head south to Wyoming. Bernard had been in correspondence with a land agent in Cheyenne, who had information about available properties in the southeastern part of the territory, near the town of Laramie. The area was known for good grazing land, reasonable prices, and a growing community of settlers. They packed up their lives in Helena, selling most of the furniture and household goods, but keeping the essentials and the sentimental items. Hannah carefully packed all of Austin's letters, now tied with ribbon and stored in a small wooden box that had been her mother's. Those letters represented their foundation, the building blocks of their love, and she would not leave them behind. On a bright morning in early May, they loaded 2 wagons with their possessions, hitched up the teams, and said goodbye to Helena. Hannah felt a pang leaving the town that had been her home for 10 years, but it was tempered by excitement for what lay ahead. Beside her on the wagon seat, Austin handled the reins with easy competence, and behind them, her father drove the second wagon, whistling a tune she remembered from her childhood. The journey to Wyoming took 2 weeks, following well-traveled roads south through Montana Territory and into Wyoming. They camped along the way, and Hannah discovered she loved sleeping under the stars with Austin beside her, loved the freedom of the open road, loved the adventure of it all. Austin proved to be an excellent trail guide, his years of cowboy experience making him comfortable in the wilderness. He knew how to find good campsites, how to manage the horses, how to handle unexpected problems. Bernard and Austin fell into an easy camaraderie, and Hannah loved watching her husband and father become friends, swapping stories around the campfire, working together to set up camp each night. They reached Cheyenne in mid-May and met with the land agent, a businesslike man named Mr. Carson who had several properties to show them in the Laramie area. Over the next week, they looked at various parcels of land, trying to find the right fit. Hannah had specific ideas about what she wanted. She needed to be able to see mountains, needed access to water, needed land that felt right in a way she could not quite explain. Austin wanted good grass for horses, some timber for building, enough acreage to grow but not so much that it would be impossible to manage. On their 4th day of looking, Mr. Carson took them to a property about 15 miles outside of Laramie, tucked into a valley with a creek running through it, and a view of the Medicine Bow Mountains in the distance. The moment Hannah saw it, she knew. "This is it," she said, turning to Austin with certainty in her voice. "This is where we are supposed to be." Austin walked the land, examining the grass, the water, the lay of the property. There was a small existing structure, barely more than a cabin, but it was sound and could be expanded. There were stands of pine and aspen that could provide building materials. The creek ran year-round according to Mr. Carson. The land rolled gently, good for horses. And the view, with the mountains rising in the distance, was breathtaking. "I think you are right," Austin said, returning to where Hannah stood. "This feels like home." Bernard bought an adjacent property, a slightly larger parcel that was better suited to cattle, with his portion of the money from selling the mercantile. The 2 properties shared a boundary along the creek, close enough for family but far enough for independence. By the beginning of June, the properties were officially theirs. They spent the next weeks in a frenzy of work, improving the cabin on Austin and Hannah's land, building a small barn, constructing a bunkhouse on Bernard's property. They hired a few local men to help with the heavy labor, and slowly, their vision began to take shape. Austin bought their first horses, 2 mares and a stallion with good bloodlines that he intended to use to start his breeding program. Bernard bought a small herd of cattle. They dug a well, improved the fences, planted a kitchen garden. Hannah learned to cook on a wood stove in the cabin, learned to make do with far less than she had in Helena, and found that she loved this simpler, harder life. By late summer, they were established enough that Austin could begin taking leather orders again. Word spread quickly through the area about the quality of his work, and soon he had more requests than he could easily handle. Hannah helped him with the business side, managing orders and accounts just as she had at the mercantile. They worked side by side in the small workshop Austin had set up in one corner of the barn, and Hannah thought she had never been happier. On a warm evening in August, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sun set over the mountains, Hannah turned to Austin and took his hand. "I have something to tell you," she said, her heart fluttering with nerves and excitement. He looked at her, immediately attentive. "What is it?" "I am pregnant," she said. "I think about 3 months along. I did not want to say anything until I was sure, but I am sure now. We are going to have a baby." Austin's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, joy, wonder, and something like fear before settling on pure happiness. "A baby," he repeated. "We are going to have a baby. Hannah, that is wonderful. Are you all right? Do you feel all right? Should you be working so hard?" She laughed at his immediate concern. "I am fine. I feel wonderful, actually, and I will continue working as long as I can. Women have babies all the time, Austin. I am strong enough to handle it." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "A baby," he said again into her hair. "A child that is part you and part me. I cannot quite believe it." "Believe it," Hannah said, happiness flooding through her. "By late winter we will be parents." Bernard was thrilled when they told him the news. "A grandchild," he said, his eyes bright. "Your mother would have been so happy. She always wanted grandchildren." Through the fall, as Hannah's pregnancy became more visible, they continued to build their life. Austin was unfailingly gentle with her, constantly worried that she was doing too much, but Hannah insisted on maintaining her routine as much as possible. She helped with the leather business, tended the garden, managed the household, all while her body grew and changed to accommodate the life inside her. In October, they received a letter from the ranch in Durango where Austin had worked. His old boss wrote to say that the elderly Mexican craftsman who had taught Austin leatherwork had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Austin was quiet for a long time after reading that letter, and that evening he told Hannah stories about the old man, about the patient way he had taught Austin his craft, about the wisdom he had shared. "He told me once," Austin said, "that leather is like life. You take something raw and rough, and with care and time and the right tools, you shape it into something beautiful and useful." He said the key was knowing when to be firm and when to be gentle, when to push and when to let the material tell you what it wants to be. "I think about that a lot when I am working. I think I will tell our child about him, about the man who taught their father a trade." "I think he would like that," Hannah said softly, "and I think he would be proud of you, of what you have built here." As winter approached, they prepared for the baby's arrival. Hannah sewed tiny clothes and blankets. Austin built a cradle from pine, carefully sanding and finishing it until it was smooth as silk, then tooling a design of horses and mountains into the headboard. Bernard bought soft wool from town, and Hannah knitted small caps and booties. The first snow came in early November, dusting the valley in white and making the mountains stand out stark and beautiful against the sky. By December, they were in the full grip of winter, snow piling deep around the cabin, the creek freezing over. They had prepared well, with plenty of firewood stacked and food stored, and they settled into the quiet rhythm of winter in Wyoming. Hannah's time came in late February, during a brief warm spell that melted some of the snow and made the world feel like it was poised on the edge of spring. Austin rode to Laramie to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered dozens of babies in the area. Bernard stayed with Hannah while Austin was gone, trying to keep her calm, though he looked nearly as nervous as she felt. Austin returned with Mrs. Henderson in record time, having pushed his horse hard. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Austin stayed by Hannah's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement. When she screamed with the pain, he looked like he might break, but he never left her. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their child was born, a healthy baby boy with a surprisingly loud cry and his father's blue eyes. Mrs. Henderson cleaned him up and placed him in Hannah's arms, and Hannah looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. "A son," she whispered. "Austin, we have a son." Austin, who had stayed remarkably composed through the whole ordeal, promptly burst into tears. He knelt beside the bed, looking at his wife and child with such love and wonder that Hannah started crying too. "He is perfect," Austin said. "You are perfect. I cannot believe I get to have this, get to have you and him in this life. A year and a half ago I was just a cowboy alone on a ranch, and now I have everything." They named him James after Austin's father, James Bernard Nichols. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, with an appetite that kept Hannah constantly nursing. Bernard was a devoted grandfather, coming over daily to check on them, to hold his grandson, to help with chores so Austin and Hannah could focus on their new son. As James grew through his first months, Hannah marveled at how completely he had changed their lives while somehow fitting perfectly into the space that had been waiting for him. Austin would spend hours just watching him sleep, or talking to him while he worked leather, telling his son stories about horses and craftsmanship. That first summer with James was a time of joy and exhaustion in equal measure. Hannah learned to manage the household with a baby, learned to work around his schedule, learned to function on very little sleep. Austin became an expert at rocking James when he was fussy, at changing nappies with quick efficiency, at doing whatever was needed. They celebrated their first wedding anniversary in March, and Austin gave Hannah a beautiful leather-bound journal, the cover tooled with an intricate design of wildflowers. "For writing," he said. "I know you do not have time for letters anymore since I am right here, but I thought you might like to write down our story, so James can read it someday and know how his parents met." Hannah kissed him, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I love it, and I love you. This year has been the best year of my life." "Mine too," Austin agreed, "though I admit much of it is a sleep-deprived blur." They laughed together, the easy laughter of two people who had built something real and lasting, who had taken a chance on love with a stranger, and found that the stranger was actually the missing piece of their souls. As James grew into a toddler, their lives fell into a comfortable pattern. The horse breeding business thrived, with Austin developing a reputation for quality animals. The leather work continued to bring in steady income. Bernard's cattle operation was successful enough that he hired a couple of hands to help him manage it. The 3 properties along the creek became known locally as a good outfit, well run and respected. Hannah found herself pregnant again when James was 2 years old. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because she was chasing a toddler and had less time to worry. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Rose after Austin's mother, was born in early spring with far less drama than James, arriving quickly and efficiently as if she knew her parents were busy and did not have time for a long labor. Margaret had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, and she was fierce from the start, demanding and passionate, and completely adored by everyone who met her. James was initially suspicious of his little sister, but he quickly became protective of her, and watching their children interact became one of Hannah and Austin's greatest joys. The years passed in the way they do, when life is full and good. James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved horses as much as his father did. Margaret grew into a spirited girl who refused to be left out of anything her brother did. They added a third child, Another boy they named Samuel, when James was 5 and Margaret was 3. Samuel was the easiest of their children, a cheerful, adaptable baby who seemed content to be carried around and watch the chaos of their busy household. Bernard thrived in his new life, looking younger and more vigorous than he had in Helena. He was a constant presence in their lives and in the lives of his grandchildren, teaching them about cattle and ranching, telling them stories about their grandmother, about the early days in Montana, about the wagon train journey west. On a summer evening when James was 7, Margaret 5, and Samuel 2, the whole family gathered at Austin and Hannah's house for dinner. It had become a weekly tradition, these Sunday dinners where they all came together. The children played in the yard while the adults prepared food, their laughter floating through the open windows. After dinner, as the children convinced their grandfather to tell them a story, Austin and Hannah slipped away to the porch, stealing a few moments alone. They sat on the bench Austin had built, Hannah leaning against her husband's side, his arm around her shoulders. "You ever think about how this all started?" Hannah asked. "About how unlikely it was that we found each other." "All the time," Austin admitted. "I think about the fact that if my old boss had not decided to expand his leather business, if he had not placed those advertisements, if you had not been the one handling the mercantile correspondence, none of this would exist. James, Margaret, Samuel, they would not exist. This whole life would not exist. I think we would have found each other somehow," Hannah said. "I have to believe that. Some things are just meant to be." Austin turned to kiss the top of her head. "Maybe you are right. All I know is that writing those letters was the smartest thing I ever did. And riding 400 miles to meet you was the best decision I ever made." "I am glad you did," Hannah said. "I am glad you were brave enough to come for me. I am glad I was brave enough to say yes to a stranger." "We are not strangers anymore," Austin said with a smile in his voice. "I think at this point I know you better than I know myself." "And I know you," Hannah replied. "I know that you still get up before dawn every morning because you love the quiet. I know that you talk to the horses like they are people. I know that you tear up every time you watch our children sleep. I know that you keep all my old letters in a box under our bed, even though you have the real me now." "I keep them because they remind me of the journey," Austin said, "of how we built this foundation. Those letters are part of our story, part of how we fell in love. I would not trade them for anything." From inside the house, they heard Bernard's voice rising and falling as he told the children some tall tale, heard their delighted laughter. Through the window, they could see James sitting wrapped at his grandfather's feet, Margaret bouncing with excitement, Samuel in Bernard's lap, thumb in his mouth but eyes wide. "This is everything I never knew I wanted," Hannah said softly. "When I was writing you those letters in Helena, I dreamed of something like this, but the reality is so much better than anything I imagined." "It is not always easy," Austin pointed out. "There are hard winters and sick animals and broken fences and children who do not sleep through the night. There are worries about money and weather and all the thousand things that can go wrong on a ranch." "I know," Hannah said, "but we face all of it together. That is what makes it good, not the absence of problems but the presence of partnership. We are a team, you and me. We always have been, from the very first letter." Austin pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. The same mountains Hannah had needed to see when they were choosing their land. The same mountains that had watched over them through years of building this life. Inside, the children's bedtime was approaching, and soon they would have to go in and help settle them down. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. But for now, in this perfect moment, everything was exactly as it should be. As the years continued to pass, the Nichols ranch prospered. James grew into a young man who had his father's skill with horses and his mother's head for business. He started handling more of the breeding program as Austin's hands began to show the wear of decades of hard labor. Margaret surprised everyone by developing a talent for leatherwork, spending hours with her father learning the craft. Samuel, the easygoing baby, grew into an easygoing boy, and then an easygoing young man who loved the cattle side of ranching and spent more time with his grandfather than anyone else. Bernard lived to see all three of his grandchildren grown, lived to see James marry a sweet girl from Laramie named Elizabeth, lived to meet his first great-grandchild, a boy James and Elizabeth named Bernard after him. He passed away peacefully in his sleep at 73, having lived to see the family he and his daughter had built flourish. They buried him on his property, on a hill overlooking the creek, where he could watch over the land he had loved. At the funeral, Hannah stood between her husband and her eldest son, holding Austin's hand while James held her other hand, Margaret on James's other side, and Samuel beside his father. 4 generations had begun with her father's willingness to let her follow her heart, and she would never forget that gift. Austin and Hannah grew old together on the ranch, watching their children have children, watching the business they had built continue to thrive. Austin's hair turned silver, his hands became gnarled with arthritis, but he still spent time in the workshop every day, still taught his craft to anyone willing to learn. Hannah's chestnut hair turned white, her face lined with the marks of a life well lived, but her green eyes stayed sharp and bright. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The celebration was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard, music playing, food in abundance. At one point, someone asked Austin to tell the story of how he and Hannah met, and he told it with the same wonder he always did, about the letters, about falling in love with words on paper, about riding 400 miles to marry a woman he had never seen. "Best 400 miles I ever rode," he said, looking at Hannah across the crowd, still seeing in her the woman whose letters had captured his heart decades ago. Would do it again in a heartbeat. That night, after all the guests had left and they were alone in the house that had been their home for 50 years, Austin and Hannah lay in bed together. Austin's arms were still strong enough to hold her, Hannah's head still fit perfectly against his shoulder. 50 years, Hannah said softly. "Half a century since the day you rode into Helena and found me at the mercantile." "Feels like no time at all," Austin said. "Feels like forever, feels like exactly right." "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Hannah asked. "When you first walked into the mercantile?" "I said your name," Austin replied. "Just your name, Hannah, and you looked at me and I knew everything I had hoped for in those letters was real." "I knew too," Hannah said. "The moment I saw you, I knew you were exactly who you said you were in your letters. Honest, good kind, mine." "Yours," Austin agreed. "Always yours. From the moment I wrote that first letter, even though I did not know it yet, I was already yours." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other as they had been for 50 years, as comfortable and familiar as breathing. Austin and Hannah were blessed with many more years together. They lived to see their grandchildren married, to meet more great-grandchildren, to watch the ranch continue into another generation. They lived to see the turn of the century, marveling at the changes that came to Wyoming and to the West. When Austin finally passed away at 78, peaceful in his sleep beside the woman he loved, Hannah grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given more than 50 years together, years full of love and family and work they believed in. She kept the letters still, the ones he had written her in that year before they met, faded now but still legible, still full of the words that had made her fall in love with a stranger 400 miles away. Hannah lived 3 more years after Austin's death, staying in the house they had built together, surrounded by family, still sharp and engaged until the very end. When she finally passed at 80, her children found the box of letters beside her bed, along with the leather-bound journal Austin had given her for their first anniversary. In it, she had written their whole story, from first letter to final days, a love story for the ages. They buried her beside Austin on the hill overlooking the creek, the same hill where her father rested. The headstone was simple, just their names, dates, and a single line that James insisted on including. She wrote him letters. He rode 400 miles. They loved each other 50 years. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations, but the story of Austin and Hannah became legend in the family. Every child born into the Nichols line heard about the cowboy who rode 400 miles to marry a woman he had never met, about the letters that built a love strong enough to last a lifetime, about the courage it took to trust your heart to a stranger who turned out to be your soulmate. And in a trunk in the main house, preserved carefully through the decades, the letters remained, tangible proof that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is write to a stranger, fall in love with words, and ride however many miles it takes to find the person your heart already knows. Their love story became the foundation upon which generations were built, a reminder that real love requires courage, faith, and the willingness to risk everything for the chance at something extraordinary. It reminded each generation that sometimes you just know, that the heart understands things the mind cannot explain, and that the most beautiful journeys often begin with a single letter and end with a lifetime of love.